Today, I want to just predominantly focus on DOM, document object manipulation. So in the online unit right here, I'm just going to click on DOM. So right here it says, when we think of interactions with web pages, we're often thinking about manipulating the document object model, a representation of our HTML file. DOM manipulation refers to changing the structure of our page while users are interacting with it. JavaScript was created for the specific purpose, and while overall it does a pretty good job of it, by manipulating DOM, you will be able to show warning messages to your users, build fluid and exciting animations, create games, and more. So this is why I want to focus on DOM today, because before it was kind of confusing as to how all of these things wire together, and DOM is essentially how we are going to finally wire HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. So DOM, by the end of this article, we're going to be able to explain the relationship between DOM and HTML. It's essentially just JavaScript and HTML. So when we're saying DOM, it means the document object model or document object manipulation. The DOM is an API. So an API is an application programming interface, and you'll see this actually a lot. A lot of technologies actually refer to their documentation as APIs. It's a very broad and general term. So API doesn't necessarily mean one thing like necessarily, but it's a very broad term that you'll see a lot. So essentially what API stands for, what it represents, is just allowing like two different technologies or two different languages, syntaxes to communicate with each other. So yeah, right here it kind of summarizes that, but it's literally meant for like if two different things like Java and JavaScript or .NET JavaScript, completely different technologies, they're allowed to interface with each other using an API. So it's a very broad term. So right here we're going to start talking about a program named FS. This is essentially a Node module. It's written in C++ because it's Node and Node compiles to C++. So down here we have a comment, but we're going to use the FS, which is shorthand for file system, use the file systems API to tell me where the file system program is to read settings.json. So right here we're declaring a JavaScript variable that's equal to fs.read file, and now we have a string reference to a path. That way our JavaScript file with Node can actually read the files off of our hard drive. Typically this is impossible with JavaScript because JavaScript is meant to be programming the web, it's meant to be programming HTML pages. It's not typically meant to be interacting with our local OS and hardware. So Node allows us to kind of bring JavaScript down and interact with our local environment in a way that typically wasn't possible before its creation. So the FS API allows us to read files from the file system and a way to write files to the file system. So what is a document? This is the most commonly used, the most commonly used document is a web page. So when they're referring to documents here, they're talking about just simple markdown language. So .md, like README files, are the most typical markdowns that we're familiar with, but HTML is actually a different type of markdown language as well. So as far as we're concerned with documents, we're just talking about HTML in a markdown language, a very skeletal structure that we can manipulate using scripting languages like JavaScript. A document can be represented in a number of ways, textually via HTML, the browser window, or represented in the DOM. So this would be JavaScript right here. It doesn't have to be HTML, it can also be SVGs, which is essentially like a image file type. And XML is what came before HTML. It was a very rudimentary and basic type of HTML protocol language. So how does DOM model the document? Well, let's come on down. Here we have a typical HTML document, right? But JavaScript allows us to kind of break this structure down into somewhat of a tree. So if we were to console log the document right now, it would come out as an HTML collection. Oh. Document. Cool. So here we have the entire page, right? If we do, let's bring that back up, .children, we should get an HTML collection. So this is essentially like an array. So what I just did is I grabbed this document that I am literally interfacing with right now, this HTML page. I said, hey, JavaScript, console log this document and then just tell me what the children are. So what it returned in the console is this HTML collection, which we can treat as an array in JavaScript. And here we get back essentially all of the different elements that we can interact with in JavaScript. So this isn't going to be as intuitive or easy to read through if we were just creating our own HTML file, but this is what this image is hinting at, is that essentially the way every HTML page or document breaks down is into this kind of like tree structure. So this is a very nested structure over here, this HTML collection, because there's multiple HTML elements on this page that actually make up this page. So it initially starts with this HTML header at the top of the tree, but then underneath it is a collection of HTML elements. So that's why we're seeing this HTML collection in our console, because underneath this parent document element, we get to see all of the other nested HTML elements that make up this web page. So that's why when I console log the document's children, what makes up this document, I get this array back essentially. You can see here with these square brackets that this is an array type. Now I could go through and look at all the different methods that are available on this data type. So if we were dealing with this HTML collection, I could call HTML collection.accessKey, HTML collection.baseURI, right? But we're not going to get into that right now. But essentially, what this is saying is I have access to all of these methods. So here we have our children of the children. We have our head. And let's see, the head, what's the head's children? We have the title, the meta, the link, right? So this is what this is showing on this left side. This all breaks down into somewhat of like a tree structure. So all I did by console logging document.children is I console logged what is underneath HTML right here. That's what DOM is. We can use JavaScript to essentially break down and interact with the HTML scripts or markdown itself. It's a fully object-oriented representation of a web page. It's a model of the document as a tree. As I showed over here, we can kind of break it down as we tunnel deeper and deeper into each element's children. And it's a way for JavaScript, for this instance, to interact with the HTML document. So interact using the dev tools. I have already done this. If you want to do this and you're using Chrome, you can go ahead and you'll bring up something that looks like this. You can go ahead and navigate to the console tab of the dev tools. And so I kind of already did a little bit of this, but if we just come down here and we type document, so like it says here, we get back the entire HTML document. So this is something, like I said in previous lectures, how JavaScript predominantly loads and operates a lot of the HTML pages that we interact with. So although it's not readily apparent, this is all JavaScript essentially in the console. We have access to the console, right? Console.log, but then everything that we're used to, such as like arrays in JavaScript, objects in JavaScript, everything like that is available in this console in our web browser because the entire web operates off of JavaScript. So that that is the purpose of teaching you guys JavaScript, and that's why we were hammering that into your guys' brains at the beginning, because now that we understand JavaScript and we're starting to understand HTML and CSS, we can really start to break down the way the web works, and we can really create like interactive HTML pages that have really cool functionality that they wouldn't have otherwise if we didn't have the knowledge of JavaScript that we do now. So I'm not gonna do all of this, but you can go ahead and do this yourself if you were so inclined. So down here, again, API stands for Application Programming Interface. It's a very broad and general term. It doesn't necessarily only apply to servers and JavaScript and so on and so forth. It's a very, very broad term. It's a way for two technologies that typically don't interface with each other to interface. So an API would allow JavaScript and Java to communicate with each other, for instance. And then down here, the DOM represents the document as an object, which is a tree structure. I kind of broke that down for you guys over here. Again, we can go into the head, go into the styles of the head, so on and so forth. So HTML is the head of the document object model. It's the root node. If we were to break down the entire object as a tree, the HTML would be the head as shown by the tree picture up here. Are there any questions about that? Does that make sense to everybody? Cool. All right. Let's go on to DOM traversal. So I get some errors over here because I have some plugins that are blocking maybe some cookies that are tracking me or something like that. So for now, I'll close out of that. Says by the end of this article, we'll be able to query the DOM for nodes. We kind of already did that. We can use CSS selectors, traverse the DOM using the parent, sibling, and children nodes, and access the values of HTML attributes and the inner text of a node. So traversing the DOM. We can use the console to interact with the document. So we're using JavaScript to interact with HTML essentially. And so we can, as we interact with HTML, also interact with the CSS because it's so tightly interbound. We can change the styling of these HTML elements with JavaScript. So if I actually open my console and I come right here, get this p tag, let's pull this over. So right here it's saying the same thing we're reading on the left. If I click on this and I bring this up, we can see a lot of CSS. So this is again a professional website. This is what it would look like if you were to push something that you created into production. You would have a lot of these weird kind of CSS selectors that are accounting for a bunch of stuff throughout the entire document. But right now we're just looking for this p tag. So if I come in here and I just say color pink.
Where are you seeing that p tag? I'm trying to find it.
If you just click this upper left icon, that kind of like, it might look like a crosshair on your console. If you click on it, it should highlight to blue. And then you can just kind of come over whichever element, click on it, and then you'll have access to this tab that says styles. And so we'll be able to scroll down and find, well, let's see. It actually looks like they did not create a CSS selector for this. So we should be able to actually just come in here and type in color. So that's rolled out, doesn't like that. That probably has to do with some overriding CSS selector that they have that I can't interact with when I click on that. But when I clicked on my little inspector widget on the upper left of my DevTools and I clicked on this p tag, let me do that again. all of a sudden down here I was able to access the styles of this individual p tag. And so with JavaScript, we'll be able to do the exact same thing by calling on the style attribute of these HTML elements. So here we have the p styling. I changed the styling in the other element. Which one was it? This one. Right here. So here we can see that when I select this HTML element, they have styling on all of their p tags, and all I did was come in and just declare that the color of all of the p tags in this HTML document should be pink. So with JavaScript, we'll essentially be able to do the same thing where we're targeting specific p tags or div tags, whichever span tags, whichever you want, and we'll be able to call the DOM and use this style key off of this HTML element and change either the color or the way it looks, the font, so on and so forth. So I will close out of that. If you're able to get it, it's pretty cool.
It's changed all my text to white.
Yeah, white isn't recommended, yeah. You might want to refresh the page at that point.
To get it to red now.
Cool, yeah. So these are different selectors. I have actually used a couple of these before, but I didn't really go into a lot of depth when I was using them. But essentially, these are going to be the ways that we can grab different HTML elements using JavaScript in our JavaScript files. So if you wanted to get an A tag by its tag name, you could just simply type in this document.getElementsByTagName and pass in the A for anchor tag, and that would get you a HTML collection of every A tag on your page. That's why it actually is plural right here. It says elements, so it returns kind of like an array of all of the A tags available on your page. So if all you have is one A tag, it will return an array still, but it would be an array of only just that one singular A tag, essentially. Similarly, here we can select multiple elements by their class name, but this can select different HTML collections, HTML elements, and so this might return a div tag, it might return an image tag, but they would all be stored within that initial array of that HTML collection. So if we wanted to name a bunch of things that should all have red text, with a class name of red text instead of home features, then we would be able to just simply use this DOM method to select all of those elements and then just call another DOM method to change all of the text to red. So there's a lot of ways that we can interact with our HTML pages using DOM methods. So we have getElementsByTagName, we have getElementsByClassName, getElementByID. So typically this is a singular element that you're returning, so it's not an HTML collection array. It's only a singular HTML element. So what happens is if you have multiple elements with the same ID, it will actually grab the very first instance it finds of the element with that ID. So even if you have multiple elements with the same ID, the reason this says specifically here, it just grabs one element, not elements, is that it does only return one HTML element. So it will grab the first ID that it matches it by, and it will return just that singular HTML element. So we have that DOM method, document.getElementByID. We have DOM methods to return collections, essentially arrays of HTML elements. We have a query selector, which essentially is if you just want to kind of take the reins in your own hands, that's when you would start to use CSS selectors such as like the dot for a class. If you wanted to grab all of the A elements, you could just simply pass in an A. It's a very verbose way of grabbing elements from your page. So if we wanted to, we can go to the MDN docs as to how this works. But essentially, this is going to grab the first HTML element that matches the parameters that you set or ask it to operate on inside of these parentheses. So right here in this example, we could see it says document.query selector, and then it's opening these parentheses and it's passing in a argument. It's very, very verbose. If we just passed in an A and a string, that would grab all of our, it would grab a singular A tag, the very first one it finds. If we passed in hashtag hello, it would grab the first HTML element that has an ID of hello. It's a very verbose way of grabbing HTML elements. So I would say if you don't feel comfortable using query selectors, stick with these kind of very specific HTML methods, because these are going to typically get you exactly what you're looking for, and you're not going to have to run into kind of like the ambiguity of query selector. But if you feel comfortable with it and you want to use it, by all means. But it is very, very verbose, and essentially all you're doing is just shortcutting, because right here I can tell that we're grabbing a class of callout newsletter. So at the very same time we're using this, we could have just as easily just used get elements by class name and just passed in callout newsletter. So there's a lot of ways, essentially, of grabbing HTML elements in DOMs. So that's essentially what I'm getting at here is there's a lot of ways of interacting with our HTML pages and manipulating the way that they look, the same way that I have changed the way that all of the p tags on this page look to pink. We have access to all of these different ways of grabbing the HTML elements, so that way we know exactly what we're grabbing and we're making sure that we're only grabbing the exact things that we're looking for. So we're predominantly going to focus on the element object. Whoops, been meaning to click on that. I will, so now my p tags are back to pink, black rather, because the actual source CSS reloaded and changed all of these back to black. But I'll go ahead and let you guys do this if you were so inclined. I'm not going to go into that just yet. So traversing the DOM, obviously that's what we're talking about right now. We have all these DOM methods available to us. If you're ever like super confused as to which ones are available to you, you could literally just type in DOM methods and Google, and we'll come to W3 again. And here it'll give us a little bit of an example. So right here, what it's showing is we can use inside of a script tag, just JavaScript. We're saying grab this HTML document, get the ID of demo. What do you know? There's only one HTML element with the ID of demo. And we're going to change the inner HTML to say hello world. So if we try this ourselves, it appears it already ran. It definitely did, but typically what you would find is we would load into this page and there would be nothing on this page. There would just be a completely empty tag, because right here in between the demo tag, all it does is just load in with just nothing in there, right? So unfortunately there's no actual like way for me to just run this, because as it is, this script tag is just going to run the moment the page loads. But what is going on, as you can see here, there's nothing in between these carets. There's nothing at all. Yet with this script tag, using the DOM, we can grab that element by its ID, demo, and we can change the inner HTML in between these carets. This is inner HTML. It's in between the carets. It's inner HTML. And we can have it equal hello world. So that's actually why we're seeing hello world over here. Let me see if I can actually bring this up in the console. See that? In between the carets now, there's hello world. Over here, there's nothing there. Yet when this page loads with the HTML and this script tag, just using JavaScript, we can go ahead and grab it, and we can set in between those carets what it should say. So here we have nothing in between the carets, and then when I inspect this element using the dev tools, I can see that JavaScript did indeed put hello world in between these carets. So that's how DOM works, is we're able to just kind of grab these HTML elements as we want, depending on how we specify the ID or what DOM method we use. We can change a lot of things on our web page using JavaScript. So let's close out of that. Come on back. So that DOM method they used was this one right here. They're just grabbing that singular p tag with the get element by ID. If you want, you could read into this a little bit more, but for all intents and purposes, we're dealing with collections, which you can treat as arrays. At the lower level language level, collections are actually a different data type. Arrays are different from collections. So this is actually a different data type, but JavaScript is able to treat it as an array. So that's why it says collection. It doesn't say like HTML array, because it's technically a collection. But JavaScript is so smart, if you want to put it that way, that it can treat it as an array. So we have child nodes, we have the first child, last child. These are all just like dot methods that you can call upon. So if I do console.log document.firstChild. It's the very first thing that we have in an HTML document, right? So in our HTML document, the first child, the very first thing that creates this HTML document is that doc type HTML. If I was to go and open VS Code and open up my boilerplate, we would see the very same thing at the very top of our HTML file. So if I do the same thing with, what is it, last child? Yeah. Last child. Oh, well, JavaScript's not that smart. We get the very bottom of, or actually, this is probably the very, very top of the document. So the last child is actually, it's just saying right here, like, hey, this is an HTML element. So that's the first thing it does. And then the last child, the last thing it does is say, this is everything that makes up my actual. So if we type in console.log document.length, well, okay. Document.children.length 1. So again, there's probably something going on behind the scenes because this is a collection. It's not technically an array.
Right, does that mean that there are no siblings?
There are no siblings to document because document is essentially the head of the HTML page entirely. If we go back, let me get out of here. This breaks it down very, very nicely. So essentially what I did is I console logged HTML at the top, dot children. So it said the dot length was only 1. I'm guessing that's because it actually technically ignores the head because for all intents and purposes, the head actually doesn't create anything. It just describes what should happen, or it imports functionality, things like that. So I think when I typed in document.firstChild, it was just showing me initially, like, the very first thing I am doing is I'm creating this HTML doc type tag. And then when I console logged the last child, it was saying the very last thing that I'm doing as this HTML header is creating the rest of the HTML element. So if I did .children, let's see. Oh, if I could spell, that would help. Document.children.children. Darn it. Why wouldn't that work? It's an HTML. Oh, okay. So let's do this again. At 0 dot children. Oh. See? We can treat it as an array. So what I just did, the reason this doesn't work, document.children.children, is because I'm trying to call .children on an HTML collection. We can't do that. Document is an HTML element. So I'm allowed to call .children on a singular HTML element. But when I tried to chain it, I'm calling it on a collection here, an array. So it didn't let me do that. So just right here, we get undefined, right? But when I run it with this 0 here, we're treating it as an array. I'm just saying grab the 0 index of this collection of children and give me that children. Give me that child's children. And we get an HTML collection. And what would you know? Guess what? We can do the same thing. Oh man, I could do it. Because it's a tree. It keeps going down and down and down and down and down. And that's why we indent our HTML like that, because it kind of replicates that tree structure. The further indented we go with our HTML elements, the more that kind of represents that tree structure of how everything breaks down. So with all of our HTML documents, we've been creating them with body as the root, right? So then body kind of compromises the entirety of our HTML element, but then that breaks down into more HTML elements. And so that's why I'm able to just keep tunneling down over and over through this document, because HTML is the head, and then as it breaks down into all these individual pieces, I'm able to go further and further and further into that HTML indentation and figure out what is making up what HTML elements. So again, now that I'm getting back another HTML collection, I could again chain on children with the index of 0 and call that children. That would give me the children of title. So right here we can see the indices of this collection. This looks pretty familiar, right? We have some script tags, some style tags, stuff like that. But if we were to access the 0 indice, we would get title. So let's go through the DOM. Let's see. Once again, we have children. If I wanted to go in here, I could access the HTML collection that makes up the children that are underneath this title HTML element. But there's a lot of things here. We have our class name. They decided not to give this HTML element a class name. They decided not to give it an ID either. Here we have access to the inner HTML. If you wanted, with JavaScript, we could just call this document.getThisElement, and the .inner HTML equals fun, and that would literally change what this is outputting. Now I don't know where this is on the page. Maybe if I click on it, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where the title is on the page, but that's not pertinent right now. The point is, if I wanted to with JavaScript, I could actually change any of these keys off of this HTML element. On click, this is a really fun one. If I wanted to, on click, if I clicked this title, I could have it change to the color green using JavaScript. So right here, instead of it being null, if we had control over this entire page, we could have it so that on click was a function. So in JavaScript, let me pull up REPL. Let it load. This is our CCF. I'm just gonna boom. And so in JavaScript, we can have an object that has a key with a value of a function. I'm just going to change this back just to a standard key. Now, it might not be readily apparent what I just did, but I essentially took this JavaScript object, assigned it a key, very, very similar right here. These are keys. These are all keys on an object. And I said, hey, this key should equal a function. You don't even need to give it a name. This is called an anonymous function. And all I want this function to do is just console log that's crazy. I didn't say anything about console log right here. Everything else is commented out. This isn't, I'm not tricking you guys. All I did was I said, hey, this object, go to this, I used dot notation to hit this key, and I said, just call the function that's there. That's what these parentheses means, is I'm calling this function. That's why like we could do things like dot length, and we can right there, it's calling that method, it's calling that function, right? So I just said right here, take this variable, go to this key, and call it. So what is the value of this key? Oh, well, it just so happens to be a function, so we called that function. And what does that function do? It console logs, that's crazy. So we can do the same thing with DOM over here. What do you know? These are all null. Because if we wanted to, we could assign these functions to these keys and have them actually change based upon how we want them to. So if I wanted, I'm sorry, I don't know where this title tag is, but I could assign an anonymous function on click so that when I click on this HTML element, the .style.color changes to green. So instead of this being null, because again, null means nothing. There's no, we're not gonna mess anything up by changing this. It's null. They're already not using it. So I don't think I can go and change the source code of this page right now, but in our own HTML page, we'll be able to come in, and this is available, again, because this is HTML. This is not like, because this is a professional website, I have access to this. This is HTML. This is the way HTML interacts with JavaScript. This is available on every single HTML element in JavaScript. So whether it's a p tag, a tag, span, whatever it is, there's all of these keys off of those that we can access at any time. Because people way smarter than us programmed HTML to work this way. So in our own projects, in our own applications, whatever we want to do, we can have it so that if we were to, one of my favorites is on mouse enter. If I was to scroll over this, that would be a mouse enter. If I was to leave it, that would be a mouse leave. I could have it so like if I had a image and I scrolled over it, it would change to a different image. It would load a different source. It would be document.getElementById.source equals this. But if mouse enter, then the source equals this, right? Like there's so many different things that you can do with JavaScript with anything. It's just, it's kind of mind-boggling the potential that is out there if you just want to use JavaScript with HTML, because this is going to be available to us, and I'll show that in a second here, no matter what. And all of these are always available. So on select, on search, on scroll. I haven't used a lot of these. The predominant ones I have used are on mouse enter, on mouse leave, on click, on change, things like that. So if you click on something and it changes, you can also have it literally run another function if it changes. So again, like this can really be as complicated or as simple as you want just by using all of these keys available to us in the DOM. So that's a little bit of the DOM there for you. Just to drive the point home real quick, I will was working with something else. Let's just go. Touch index.html, code index.html. So here I just use the bash command touch to just create this completely blank HTML file. So now what I'll do is I'll do open index.html. Console.log document. Okay, so there's nothing going on there. Typically we'll have something. Console.log document.children, and we get an HTML collection, and in this completely barren, completely empty HTML file using just my boilerplate, I again have access to all of those keys I was just showing you guys. So that's what I was trying to show you guys real quick. Is no matter where you are, what you're doing, I'm not even connected to the internet right now. I'm literally reading this HTML file off of my hard drive. You always have access to these. So that's why the DOM is so cool and why it's so important, because it allows us to interact with our HTML pages using JavaScript and interact and manipulate them in ways that you otherwise would not be able to. And it's created in this way because JavaScript runs the internet, and because HTML is so prevalent, they're just married together, and that's just the way it has been for several years now. So again, this was done by people way smarter than me, and all I know is I can just take advantage of it and use it as appropriate. So that's just kind of like a quick intro to DOM. So I'm going to stop.